black ones too. Handshake there.
The decision to lower benefits to single mothers. Now, putting them onto the New Start allowance means they get significantly less when their child turns 8.
Julia Gillard's welfare cuts have left her more than $100 a week worse off.
A class of people who have been the subject of grandfathered arrangements are being put on the same rules as everyone else.
In 2013, a besieged Julia Gillard was under both political and economic pressure to do some tough budget balancing. In bowing to that pressure, she made a highly contentious decision which has hit a particularly vulnerable group hard for a decade and has echoes for the current government.
Overnight, 80,000 women were taken off the parenting payment and put onto the dole, losing about $100 a week in income.
Author and journalist Anne Summers is a former head of the Office of Status of Women and a former advisor on women to Prime Minister Paul Keating.
There was a lot of disagreement, I understand, in Cabinet, re-endorsing this decision, and one of those most opposed to it was a politician by the name of Anthony Albanese. He was actually the Minister for Transport and Infrastructure at the time, but he, of course, had been brought up by a single mother. He understood the situation and he vehemently opposed it. He, of course, today is the Prime Minister and is in a very good position to fix this.
The 2013 decision to limit the single parent's payment to those with children under 8 may well haunt members of the current government. But the decision's impact on tens of thousands of women and children is just one facet of a broader problem that arises after 40 years of welfare stringency, designed on the principle that being mean would keep people keen to get back in the workforce. That broader problem is that so many forms of income support can act in exactly the opposite way they are supposed to. That is, they provide barriers to people getting back to work. And this particularly applies to women.
Economist and Grattan CEO Danielle Wood captured the scale of the economic opportunity represented by Australian women's workforce participation in her memorable quip, and I quote, "I can't help but reflect that if untapped women's workforce participation was a massive ore deposit, we would have governments lining up to give tax concessions to get it out of the ground."
At last year's Job Summit, Sam Mostyn was appointed to chair a Women's Economic Equality Task Force.
It was no mistake that the panel on gender equality and pay for women was the first thing that we did at this summit.
The task force will soon deliver its report to the government, and today Mostyn outlined some of its initial recommendations.
Here's what we want to do. We want to absolutely back in the commitment to a universal, high-quality early education and care system. We've been delighted with the increases in PPL to date, but we want superannuation on paid parental leave. One of our primary recommendations will be for the restoration of the single-parent payment for women with children over 8 years old.
Single-parent families, predominantly single-mother families, experience some of the highest poverty rates in the country. The arbitrary drop in payments when their children turn 8 is also driving single mothers to drop out of study.
If we hadn't gone through with those really crucial and harmful policy decisions, we would have had more women qualified. What they also probably left with is a HECS debt.
At the same time Mostyn's committee has been working up recommendations for the government, a Senate inquiry into poverty in Australia heard evidence last week that repeatedly emphasised this point, that it is women in every stage of their lives and their children who are overwhelmingly found to be the ones living in poverty.
Living in poverty is like living in a permanent lockdown. It's also important to understand that poverty in Australia is gendered, like violence.
The Senate inquiry has been told the temporary coronavirus supplement halved the number of children in poverty. The decision to cut it plunged hundreds of thousands back into poverty.
Yet, as a parliament, we chose to reverse this. We chose a return to poverty, to trap millions of Australians and their children in poverty and impede their ability to thrive and be healthy.
But it is not just the rate of welfare payments or that single parents have payments reduced when their children turn 8 that can work against women getting out of poverty and into the workforce. Economist Angela Jackson produced modelling this week for the Thrive by 5 Foundation, which showed the so-called activity test for childcare and early education support also works against women wanting to rejoin the workforce by setting up a sort of catch-22 under which they can only get the childcare support they need to go out and find work if they already have a job.
We also want the activity test abolished as part of the childcare subsidy. You will have seen Angela Jackson's extraordinary economic analysis that has shown that there's over $8 billion, a prize of $8 billion to the Australian economy annually if we abolish the activity test.
The government says it remains committed to its election promise to consider the impact of every economic decision on women.
In every caucus meeting, every ERC, every cabinet deliberation, every decision we make, the impact on gender is being assessed and understood before decisions are taken. Gender is not an add-on, but it's central to our thinking.
But last week's announcement of a relatively small change in the short term to tax concessions for people with multi-million-dollar superannuation balances throws into stark contrast the different way policies are debated in this country and their different impact on men and women. Women generally have much lower superannuation balances than men, and, as we have seen, are overrepresented amongst our poorest households.
There's two groups, and they're about the similar in number. There's 80,000 people who are lucky enough to have superannuation accounts worth $3 million or more, in some cases a lot more. And there's another group that's about 87,000, and that's the single mothers that I'm concerned about, who have to exist on JobSeeker of around $780 a fortnight. Why is their having to pay a little bit more tax such a talking point, whereas these women sliding progressively into further and further into poverty is something that we just shut our eyes and pretend isn't happening?
Having opened its eyes to the problem of poverty, the pressure is now on the government to do something about it in the May budget.